Hello, this interview is with one of the eminent producers of the late 1970s and early 1980s, a Grammy Award winning producer, Mike Howlett. Sir, thank you very much for taking time for this interview. Firstly, I'd like to ask you, why were synthesizers used in the first place?
Why were they used? Oh.
Was there any requirement? Was it because of some sort of a cultural movement, or was it because people needed something abstract, an abstract sound, or they wanted to experiment with technology? What was it?
Well, I think these things evolve, don't they? The first, technically the first synthesizers were things like the telharmonium, which was an attempt to distribute music by wire to loads of households, kind of cable network. That was done in the 1880s, and they had a tone wheel which could generate oscillating currents, and then a little kind of transducer to deliver to stimulate the air. Why exactly? I think is hard to say. I think it's probably a byproduct almost of trying to create microphones and telephones. Trying to transmit voices across distance. That process, began the moment you start generating sound electronically, which is what all audio is. It's not only a matter of time before you cut out the input process, and just the fact that you need a microphone to capture vibrations in the air and turn them into oscillating currents, vibrating currents. At a certain point, if you can generate the oscillations without an external device, then you're into synthesis, aren't you? You're kind of making sounds from electronically, and I think it kind of went in reverse like that. I don't think people sat down and thought, wouldn't it be great if we could make any kind of waveform? But because you could make waveforms with, say, oscillators, once electronics had evolved to that level, well then people will, with the creative imagination, will think, "Ooh, I could use this to make more interesting sounds," and that's the nature of the artistic mind. Yeah, Louis Theremin was extraordinary, and that way of generating, frequencies that way, and so ahead of his time as well. And I don't think electronic music really did much better than he did until the 50s, and then when they used the theremin anyway, and that there were things like the Onde Martineau, of course, which was again using that same principle of differential frequency, wasn't it? But I think Robert Moog was the change, wasn't it? Because when he sort of
more portable
made it into having things like an envelope generator and a filter, voltage control filter. Those are the key inventions, I think. And there was always this idea that you could replicate natural sounding instruments, whereas of course it never did. It does now, but that's only because we've developed sample synthesis. So you actually take a sample of a real waveform and then you resynthesize it. And so, you could get some fairly convincing violin sounds, I think, but very rarely could you get anything rich enough that was convincing enough. And for me, what was interesting anyway was the sound of a synthesizer. It wasn't so much that you wanted it to be sounding like another instrument, you wanted it to sound like a synthesizer. The analog synthesizer had a new sound that nothing else sounded like. And we're talking about early influences, and there were the Doctor Who stuff, of course, with Delia Derbyshire, which I think was very influential. I mean, I think that also using the theremin on Good Vibrations, with Brian
Beach
Wilson,
Boys.
the Beach Boys, that was a fantastic early use of synthesizer that I remember. But really the biggest influence really was Kraftwerk. You see the impact of Kraftwerk on all those bands. Humanly took so much from Kraftwerk,
Exactly.
In fact, I saw Kraftwerk when they, 1973 or 4, when they came to England and played in London, and I went and saw them, and I was always impressed by them, but it wasn't until they came over here a couple of years ago, it's 2004 I think, maybe early 2005, and saw their show again, and it'd been a long time, and I just thought, that's incredible. They just, Depeche Mode, Humanly, Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark.
In fact, I think that title has also been lifted from Kraftwerk.
Is it from a Kraftwerk song? I didn't know that at the time. It's so much, it's so influenced by Kraftwerk, which is not.
They've openly admitted the influences as well.
I think everyone does. They all recognise that Kraftwerk are the really the pioneers, and they just took that stuff and made it into a whole new genre, and I think that's they must be recognised like that. But what was it? So that's to me that was the influence. That's the perspective that we look at with it. And the moment I think that people stopped worrying about trying to emulate other sounds, in other words, stopped trying to synthesize natural sounds, then you had an instrument that was positive and creative, that was its own sound. Nothing sounded like a good analog synthesizer, making great analog synth sounds. There are definitely times move, and I think what happens is that some people make some sounds in a small circle that appeal, that people go, that's lovely, and it kind of for a number of reasons that sound articulated the modern, and I think your idea of the modern is very good, because in particular in the 50s was a very modernist period, right? And after the Second World War, there was a whole kind of belief in science and a brave new future that was going to be synthetic and scientific, and we'd cure all diseases, and the future would be bright. And I remember the Jetsons. I don't know if you ever saw the Jetsons, but it was like the Flintstones cartoon series, the same people, but set in the future, a future family from when people had anti-gravity cars, and we all lived in sort of apartments on top of very tall, thin things miles in the sky, and they had a band on that once, and that was done in the early 60s, I think, mid-60s. They had a band on that which was supposed to be a pop band of the future, and they had a stand-up double bass but solid body, which actually hadn't been invented yet, I don't think. And they were sort of guitars that were like sticks, again, which came later, Steinberger's, and the drummer had pads, which of course again hadn't been invented yet. And so this is, art very often predicates, it's or predicts rather than emulates. And so somebody imagined these things, and the next took another 20 years. Although I'm still very disappointed with the future. I think it should be a lot more. We don't have any anti-gravity machines, we don't have whole walls of television, although we do now have the flat screen plasma, so that's a big improvement. But the music was kind of beep, boop, beep, boop, and I thought, fantastic. Again, apparently there's a movement in Germany again. They've always been very advanced with their electronics and Kraftwerk to start with. But apparently there's another movement, I think a Hamburg movement at the moment, which is apparently doing it, taking kind of, I haven't heard it yet, somebody was telling me just the other day.
This whole movement, with punk, post-punk, psychedelic rock, and the so-called synth pop, the whole movement, how did it start?
Well, I think you've got two different periods going on there, because psychedelic rock was a 60s and early 70s movement, and then the post-punk sort of new romantics and modernists was a later thing. So I don't know quite what, how you mean. This psychedelic era arose in the 60s. Partly inspired by people like the Beatles and the arrival of LSD. I think that people were transported into internal fantasies by the music, and if the music could then respond to it, or people who had that experience decided that they could, they had an audience that was prepared to go a lot further in musical explorations, and that evolved, as usual, a combination of the timing, and the technology. The invention of the mini Moog, Robert Moog putting together that and the evolving of that way of the modular synthesis, where you could have signal generators and oscillators, and then filters and voltage control, the principle of voltage control, all that combined to make a synthesizer a more portable and usable piece of equipment. And it happened at a certain time when there was a very popular uprising in popular music of the Beatles and the 60s and psychedelia and all that. So that music evolved that way. But then in the 70s we had banging noise out there. We had Kraftwerk, who as we were discussing, Kraftwerk are kind of the godfathers of all the later stuff. They're probably the first band to really turn it into a pure synthesized pop group. Without the instrument just being an add-on. It was a completely the whole thing was pure synthesis but pop, and they were deliberately doing that, and they were very wry, dry German wit there, but they are a very funny band when you listen to them live. You can see that there's a certain element of tongue-in-cheek about them. But they were extraordinary because they did that. But I think also the other early uses that are worth remembering and noting were Pete Townsend, in Bubba Thingy, and out here in the streets, what's that one? Teenage Wasteland, fantastic use of synthesis.
Yes.
In rock, and so that that when you try to see a strain or a theme, well, you can see that the instrument has been invented. Yeah. Various people have messed with it,
and also the Beach Boys.
The Beach Boys. Well, we were talking about the theremin, of course. Again, a brilliant use of that.
Yeah. So it all takes us back in time in a way. I mean.
But these things. People have been. As I was saying before, the moment that I think it evolved out of the telephone and out of radio technology. Once you could, there was an element of synthesis in all that, because you turned an audio waveform into an electronic or an electrical oscillation, and that oscillation can be manipulated and amplified. That is the first simple manipulation, but filtered in various ways, and that's probably the root of the whole thing, going back in time. But once you've done that, then you're in the world of generating an electrical pulse, giving it, treating it to give it different shapes, and then amplifying it and feeding it back into a coil of wire attached to a cone in a magnetic field, and it jiggles the air, and you create new sounds you've created a sound out of the pure electronics. So once that's happened, which goes way back to those days. Anyway, we're more interested in the cultural aspect, I think, are we not? And so how it then got, there's a little bit of use of electronics throughout the later 70s pop world, but of course the punk movement was very anti everything, including techno. People like Jan Hammer and Mahavishnu Orchestra, who were using synthesizers for jazz and jazz rock, and there's several examples of pop music that I can't think of the pure kind, not the Kraftwerk artistic kind, but the punks didn't use much in the way of synthesis. at first. They were really, and they were kind of anti-technique. So if it required too much musical ability, it was probably not going to be used. And I saw a lot of punk bands in the 70s live, and very, very few. I can't think of anything. There were some. But then, very soon after that, there was a reaction to the punk movement, which was itself reactionary, of course.
Yes.
And the new romantic thing, as it was called, came along, and that's when I got very involved with bands like Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark and Blancmange, who were all very big on analog synthesis. But of course, I'd had some experience before with that, because Tim Blake, who you want to talk to who had been with Hawkwind, had joined this group called Gong that I was a member of, and he brought his VCS, it was a Synthi A, which was a VCS3 in a suitcase, really. And he was, a pure electronic pop musician. He really played a few melody lines, but he wasn't really, in my opinion, his strength wasn't keyboard, it was sounds. He was great at filtering and sweeping and, creating, sort of lovely electronic landscapes that gave the band a certain atmosphere. So I was introduced to it from that. And also when I left that band, I remember in about 1976, I think, I was looking in music magazines, 76, 77 anyway, and in electronics magazines you would see build your own digital delay device, or build your own oscillator, or build your own synthesizer. A famous one in Elector magazine was had a build the Elector format, and every month they would have the circuit board, they would have the circuit diagram and instructions on how to do it, and in the back pages you could send off and you could get a bag of components and a printed circuit board. And I thought, well, I've never done electronics before, but I thought it can't be that difficult, because a lot of friends of mine did it and they weren't any cleverer than me at school, so I thought, okay, so I went to a night school for a year, and I learnt how to read a resistor and how to read a transistor or a diode and how to solder it up, and I built each of these. Every month there came out a module, the VCO, and then the voltage control filter, and then the VCA, the voltage control amplifier, and then envelope generators, and the ring modulator, I think, and you could build this thing. So I built up this synthesizer and eventually put it in a box with it. Had two oscillators with switchable, 4 different switchable waveforms, and you could patch out of that into the filters. Very much like, let's say, the Roland Series 100 synthesizer, in the same layout, same kind of structure. But of course mine was black with white lettering, because I painted it myself. I drilled the holes in the metal too. So I built a synthesizer, from component parts, but I didn't design it. My electronics was never that good, but I understood how it worked. I knew that you were taking a waveform with a bunch of harmonics, and you're filtering away stuff, which is what subtractive synthesis is all about. But in terms of for example, Messages, which is the first single I did with Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark, their main instrument was the Korg micro preset, and it came with most of it. So it had very limited amount of. It was monophonic to start with, one note at a time, and a very limited filter and envelope. You couldn't really change it that much, but a bunch of preset sounds. But you listen to the sounds of it, and it was incredibly rich and fat. It's a nice sounding synth, and interesting. They just used it it went all the way through this piece, and it just went, from a low A to a middle A to a high A, and they would just hold one note on the keyboard, and they had the octave switch. So you could start down an octave, up an octave, up an octave, down an octave, switching away like this. So you think, well, there's not a lot of technique going on here, but it's taking, this instrument and doing something unusual with it, just doing something musical with it that you like. I mean, and I think that's how a lot of this evolves. I don't think it's really, strategy and planning at the time. It's the old saying, that analysis and sort of reflection takes place after the event. So you don't, at the time, an artist is following his or her inspiration. There's not as much. I think there's as much conceptualizing in art as people like to think. I think artists do stuff and then they realise that there were reasons, but that they didn't understand themselves either. It's the nature of art, I think, that stuff happens, and then you think about it. But I mean, I've had that. You write a lyric and then it comes true in your life. It's very odd how this happens, and it's irrational. I can't even argue it. So what was your next question?
But don't you think it's interesting because there's always been a need for a change, and with the theremin and the ondes martenot and telharmonium, there was always this vision for tomorrow. But it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was really prominent in the late 1970s and early 80s. With bands such as the Human League and Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark, Kraftwerk, all of them, were approaching subjects that were futuristic and that was a bit left field. They were embracing technology, and they always this concept of futurism was always a theme, at least in the early stages.
So I think it's a 20th century theme.
Was it a movement as such? I mean, a cult sort of a following for this.
It is an interesting question, isn't it? It is interesting, but I don't know, to be honest. I have no idea. What I do know is that, certainly the 50s, I was a child, very small child in the 50s, but by the time of the mid-60s, when the hippie things started to come in, up till then there was definitely a kind of great belief in the future being, and the modern and the scientific, and you see that reflected in those Conran chairs and Biedermeier actually is the same, and there was the same thing happening after the First World War. Maybe it's a post-war optimism. The 20s had a huge futuristic modernist thing. But equally, H.G. Wells, that was War of the Worlds. That was written when, in 1910, around this time, I think, somewhere around that period. It's cyclical, I think. People believe in the future for a while, and then they start, get disappointed and believe in doomsday, Armageddon, and you'll see this cycle swings about quite often. So there'll be huge optimism and great belief in the modern and the futurist flavors. And then I suppose they get disappointed, and then people start to look at all the ugly things that are possible to see, and they swing back again. Punks were very much that. There's very much against it, and in fact, the hippies, in a way, were a kind of apocalyptic Armageddon vision, because it was saying the science has gone too far. We must go back to the garden. We must return to nature. And although it's presented as very optimistic and positive, I remember at the time a lot of people, saying the world is terrible. The modern industrialized world is destroying the planet, and it's the end of civilization. We must go back and live in nature, and away from all these corrupt things of civilization, and we could have free love and live in harmony with nature. And this is a reactionary movement in itself, and it's these are swings and roundabouts. I think people always, when I say swing, they are swings. They swing to and fro. The pendulum of human perception and cultural perception swings about regularly, always. and even faster than decades. But I think in pop music you see it very much. In popular music, you get flavours that only last for less than a decade, but the movements come, and usually they're saying that what went before was rubbish, and
yes.
it takes about 2 decades before you realise that it was actually really good, and it acquires the patina of age, and then you can understand it better.
But then, don't you think there were some exceptional cases? For instance, with bands like Hawkwind, who were originally hippies, but they had this. They embraced technology. They embraced spirituality, and they sort of combined these elements into their music. And science fiction, for that matter.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, in essence, I mean, I've seen a lot of Hawkwind gigs over the year. I mean, I played on the same bill with them at Gong, and I still occasionally jam with Nick Turner. We did something at the Green Gathering, I think, 2003. Anyway, they, in one level, you could argue that they were really just a rock band with a synthesizer and a nice sexy girl dancing with them. But I don't. I mean, I do. I mean, I don't. I think they were more than that. But what they were also, they were allied with the Michael Moorcock science fiction vision, and so that's a potent thing. It was a fantastic thing. At their best, when they were sort of this roaring wind, Hawkwind sound with Stacey dancing like a vision, and wading and Nick wading away, and it was and the synthesis kind of was this big roaring machine, sort of Hawkwind silver machine thing that was awesome, and combined with all the colourful projections, light shows, and the imagery and the association of the future, of the far future, of the science fiction future. That combination made a great impact. And you're right, it was it's a visionary thing. But it does what it's doing is it's also inspiring the believers or the audience into being optimistic, into believing that the future can be will be full of sound and vision and colour like this, and it's something that people like to imagine, a brilliant future that's exciting and adventurous.
And have you ever been associated with the Human League, with their sounds, with their?
Only through a girlfriend who signed them to Virgin Music Publishing, I think. She signed their publishing in the early 70s, in the mid 70s. Was it? When did they come out? Late 70s. Yeah, so late 70s, and I used to go to a lot of gigs. I used to see them play quite a lot.
Yes. Their sounds were completely futuristic, in the sense that they never used any traditional instruments. And
they were complete 100% synthesizer band. Yeah.
But it's interesting because I happened to read an article about them in a book. It's got a lot to do with the place that they hail from, Sheffield. Yeah. Which
the steel town.
It's a steel town, and moreover, it was at the time of economic instability in Britain. Sheffield was exceptionally doing well, and it was a prosperous town. Young people were exposed to synthesizers, science fiction movies, and books. Do you think the natural surroundings and the economy of the land helped bands such as the Human League and Cabaret Voltaire to experiment and convey that particular mood through their songs, especially with the Human League, with that kind of futuristic.
Yeah, it's possible, isn't it? I mean, I wonder. because you get, the way the Beatles, there's a whole bands came out of Liverpool at that time, and you get a sort of periods where a lot of bands come out of a certain area, or the Manchester scene of Oasis in the 90s and Ocean Colour scene and all those Mancunian bands. It's hard to know whether to attribute to me, because I've been to Sheffield quite a lot. I've played there quite a few times. It has a most wonderful city hall, which is a sort of huge oval. It's like a giant egg, and inside and outside it's a little bit like a spaceship. So it could be that they think maybe it's subliminally influenced the children of this town to believe in the future. And it is also, having been a very industrialised town where they made Sheffield steel, which is very fine steel. Who can say, I worked with another band called Comsat Angels who came out of Sheffield. Very nice lads. A little bit of synthesis in it, but mostly guitar band. And, I don't know. I don't know any specific reason why that would happen, but yes, certainly there's. Other than that, it's no different from a lot of other industrialised towns in the north.
But how are the sounds used? How did they decide that this is the sound that will convey this mood, or that will paint such a picture? How did they decide that? I mean, because of course now we have because of computerization and programs such as Pro Tools, we have a sense of how to come up with this sound and that sound, but and we also have banks, so a sample of sounds. But how is it done then? I mean, who decided that this is the final sound? And how are they stored?
Do you mean in the recording process? What decision is made when you say this sound works? It's one of those mysteries, and I've actually had long arguments with some musicians about it, that I hear a sound, or they play a sound, and I think it sounds wrong, so I'll say, give me another option. So they'll give me another option, and then finally I'll go, yeah, that makes me feel good. I like that. It sits in the mix, for various reasons you can argue, but then equally an artist could turn around to me and say, well, I don't agree with you. I think that sounds utterly wrong, and I liked my sound better. And that's the kind of impossible. There's no truth about that. There's no measure of what's right or not. Even if it turns out that your choice of sound is on the record and the record sells 1 million copies, you could argue, well, you were right, you were proved right because it sold 1 million copies, but it may not have been the reason the song sold, or even if it was the reason, who's to say that the other sound, although it wouldn't have sold as many, because it wouldn't be as popular, but had it a number of valid arguments going for it, and in the end it's not even arguments, because it's absolutely subjective with that. I think sound is very much subjective. I don't think there's any formula you can apply to say, why does this tonal ingredient sound right, but this one sounds wrong? I mean, often it's not really that. Often it's what it is that this tonal ingredient gives it a certain atmosphere and flavour, and this tonal ingredient gives it another atmosphere and flavour. And the question is then, what do you want? What do you prefer? What are you trying to do with that piece of music? Are you trying to create, a sort of calmness and stillness, or are you trying to create, energy and innovation and is it trying to represent anger, or is it trying to represent happiness? It doesn't, it's really partly that's partly what you're then thinking. You're thinking, what is the plan here? What am I trying to do?
Do you think the credit goes to the manufacturers of the instruments, such as Moog, Robert Moog, or
say that again?
Do you think the manufacturers,
Yeah.
the people who manufacture the instruments, they deserve the credit, or they are the unsung heroes of this? Because each and every synthesizer.
You know what you're saying. It's a funny one, isn't it? It's like, Leo
unique,
Fender invented
sound,
the Fender guitar.
Because now we have bands, who say that, okay, we want this sound, so we're going to use Moog synthesizer. We want this sound, so we're going to use EMS, or a VCS3. For
or Yamaha or a Korg. I know they all sound different.
Yeah.
That's the nice thing about it. I mean, I quite like that about synthesizers, especially the early analog ones, because it was like the Fenders and the Gibsons in the guitar world. If you want a certain rock sound, you didn't use the Fender, you'd use the Gibson. But if you wanted a different kind of rock sound, you had to use the Fenders, not the Gibson. They have their own tone, and the same with Korg and Yamaha and Roland, and Moog and EMS. All those different people manufacturing all these different things, all to the same basic theory, but they all use different components, and something ends up with a sound, and it works for a number of reasons. Yeah.
But do you think these techniques have been fundamental in the development of a new musical genre, like for instance synth pop or industrial rock or industrial synth sound?
Well, yeah, I think because you can do it, people will do it. People are very creative and imaginative, and somebody somewhere fiddling about will go, I wonder what happens if I plug it backwards, and crank it to distortion and go, oh, and this is what Joe Meek was all about, that he'd take those tape machines and overload them. He was another influence in a way, because he did this space record from the blue people, what's it called? Anyway, whatever. And he was getting all his sounds really by overloading tape and desks and massive distortion and over compressing and all sorts of stuff. But and it does sound pretty ropey in modern terms. But he's generating strange new sound. But the question was why. Do the manufacturers? They deserve huge credit for actually understanding that it could be done, and also when they responded to the uses made. I always think that's very smart too, because they may just have thought they were making, something for sound effects, but then found somebody was using it for music, and then, of course, Wendy Carlos, who made that Switched On Bach record, and taking all the Moog stuff and generating all these and playing. I mean, what an extraordinary work that is when you understand how difficult it was at the time, and tuning difficulties and the rest of it. And it actually, it's fun, and it's in a one way a promotional tool. But I don't think that was the motive. I don't think the motive of most artists is ever cynical. I think they're just simply following what they believe is appropriate. And I don't think the manufacturers are very... I'm sorry about yawning, I had a late night. I don't think the manufacturers either are that cynical. They want to sell their equipment for sure, and so they will, advise and push stuff in a certain direction, but most of the interesting things always happen by chance, without any big business trying to create a new interest or anything. It's simply what people do. The creative imaginative people fiddle with stuff, and then they get a noise, or they get something that looks interesting out of it, and they put it on a wall and say it's art. And some of it is. And I think that's those things are symbiotic. The technology and the creative imagination feed off each other. You get an invention like the synthesizer, and you give it to somebody with a musical imagination, and they'll play around with it, and they'll come up with something that works. They'll make something musical out of it, just the same as you'd make something musical if you were, given some pots and pans, and you could tap them, and you could go, oh, I can make a drum sound, or a kind of xylophone-y thing here. People are, have some people have that ability to make music out of anything, and a musician will then take anything and some new invention like the Mini Moog or the VCS3 and play with it until they can make something that gives they regard as a satisfying musical experience.
Yeah, actually that's an interesting point because some of the members of the Human League, for instance, were computer operators before they joined the Human League, and so they could embrace technology with the musical ideas, so they could explore that. So that's an interesting point. But what about the development of sequences and synthesis and live performance? How are they used? I mean, how did they develop into a live?
Well, I mean, obviously there were a lot of problems with the instability of things like the VCS3 and the Moog when they first came out. All the early analog synths were very unstable, and they would drift in pitch. And any of those bands, you would see them tuning up furiously between each number because it'd start off in tune, and then within the end of the song it's already drifted out of pitch because of heat and a number of other reasons why the circuits, they weren't stable really, and so it was limited in some ways by that. But that, of course, gradually improved.
And which synthesizers were used? Were more prominent during that?
Well, certainly the Mini Moog, the VCS3, and the ARP Odyssey, I think, was very popular with a lot of people because that was a bit more stable. But they all drifted, honestly. Any synthesizer in those days drifted a little bit in pitch, and it was notoriously difficult to get a certain sound back. You could write it all down, and you could patch it all up, but you could patch it all up the way it was written down, but it still didn't sound the same.
And how was the recording carried out? I mean, how was everything mic'd? During the days of the synthesizer, when the synthesizers were.
Well, generally the synthesizer is not, is not reliant on. It's not an acoustic instrument, so it doesn't make a noise until it's plugged into a speaker. You could mic up the speaker if you want to have the characteristic of the speaker, or the amplifier that you're using, but most people would have just taken a direct signal from a synthesizer. If you wanted a certain effect, you might feed it out again to an amplifier and drive an amp to get some amp distortion. But I did that a few times, but I don't know if it was used much. And also we found that because it wasn't used much, that a year later that old the SSL had this kind of you have to put in a password, and there's various little test things that they do with it. And I remember seeing one that a year later it had just worn thin.
And were there any considerations given to quality, the sound quality, so it should be like this? Were there any set parameters? It should follow this particular parameter, and it should not cross this limit or something.
Well, any more than there are two things. Most keyboard players, you put them in a band, and they will play big, thick chords, and it becomes very difficult for anyone to deviate from that sort of harmonic structure and stranglehold, really. At least with most synths in the early days of the 70s and 80s, they were monophonic, so they could only play one note at a time. Although they used a lot of echoes, they tape delay to double up notes and to make them ring on further, so you can build up very rich, complex harmonic things like Terry Riley does. That's a fabulous early, very influential early synthesizer piece. I think Rainbow and Curved Air. You must have heard that.
Yeah.
Which is a remarkable and lovely piece. But I don't know. Yeah, so the evolution into performance, is that side of it. It's an interesting sound. It works very well, but it was very unstable. So the electronic side was more usable than the other one, unless you quickly tuned up before you did a song. If you had to do a solo, you'd have to tune one up pretty quickly with headphones.
So could you just talk about VCS3?
Well,
synthesizers.
what's to say? I mean, the clever and the mad thing is the matrix patching, of course, but it's not really that bad. But I mean, I like the matrix patching thing is that you can send the same thing to lots of different parts without interrupting the path, depending on the pin actually. But yes, that whole concept of interfacing, and it's got all the basic ingredients, doesn't it? It's got three oscillators,
and
isn't it?
the noise excuse me, the noise generator as well.
Yes, that was very popular because, and feedback circuits in the filter, so you can do all that whistly sweeping through noise. It's an archetypal, but in a way, I mean, it's a bit. I like the multi-tuning knob, the multi-turn knob on it too, that you could fine-tune it because you needed that to be able to keep it stable, or you had to keep sort of subtly readjusting it live if you wanted to keep it in tune. So, but apart from that, I mean, and also, I mean, I like when they put it in a suitcase, and it was a Synthie A, pretty much the same synth in a suitcase, and the lid of the suitcase had this touch-sensitive keyboard that was printed on it, on a board inside the back of the top, the lid of the case, and they'd also put a little memory, so you could actually go, play a tune, and then hit a button, and that would just keep cycling around and round and round. If you played it tidy enough, it would be as good. It was like the first real sequencing going on.
And I happened to discover recently that the bands Hawkwind and Human League, both of them used the VCS3 synthesizer.
Yeah.
So that's interesting because both of them were completely different bands. But
Yeah.
I think to perhaps convey this mood of futurism and something modern, I think. Do you think taking that into consideration, the VCS3, satisfied their needs in terms of conveying that particular mood, that sound?
Well, the sound is, at the time was of itself modern. The synthesizer sound, because it was new, was modern. It was futuristic even, so it's a sci-fi kind of thing. And I'm sure people will be taking it.
Even then, I personally feel that people are not doing something new. I mean, the artists are not doing something new. They probably embrace synthesizers and play them, but then they don't come up with something that is going to be groundbreaking in a way. It's like revisiting the past and taking elements from the past. And
but we old timers feel that about all of the music. You say, well, rock and roll. You go and hear so many bands, guitar, bass, and drums, just playing all the chords, the same old chord structures, about the same old problems, which is teenage angst. But I mean, I'm not that skeptical because I think every generation has to reinvent itself. It has to restate eternal, ancient values. We can see in Plato was complaining about the youth of his day, being indolent and liking loud, raucous music. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that 2,500 years ago people were complaining about this. I'm sure they were complaining about it 10,000 years ago, and they will be complaining about it in another 5,000. But so you can listen to it and go, it is the same. It's just what we did, but it's not the same because it actually, if you took that music from my youth and put it here, it wouldn't sound right. It would sound, it would sound dated already. But also, if it were fresh and brought in now, it would still be wrong because it has to be rearticulated for the times. I believe. I think each of these. If I went like somebody like Block Party or Franz Ferdinand or the Editors, and you listen to a band like that, and it's new, it suits the times. Its fashion, its look, and its style are also as important as its sound. And so, and that generation hasn't heard it, and they need it restated for them in their way, and it will be slightly different. And it does evolve. And the same with the synthesizer. There will be bands come along. Undoubtedly, there will be synthesizer bands. There's probably one right now, that's practicing
but as in
in a shed.
Moment,
A movement. Well, movements too. The trouble I think we've got that you need media to create movements, and the media have become very fragmented. You know,
Yes.
you can have
become biased in a way.
Well, no, you've got so many options. I mean, go online and you go to some website and it's some obscure taste of music, and you know, it might be 100,000 people around the world that go to that website, but it's, you know, there's another 100,000 go to that website, and another 1,000 go to listen to that radio station. On, you know, the options are infinite, and so it's, you know, it's easier to get a movement when you've only got 2 or 3 avenues of expression. You know, the medium. So it could be that we won't see such big defining movements again.
Well, one last question. Again, coming back to the topics on synthesis and futurism, do you think they go hand in hand, both the concepts?
What goes hand in hand? Futurism and synthesis. Yeah, they do, because the thing about the synthesizer is that it was always associated with the future and the modern and science fiction, right back to the 50s. You know, as we know, with the theremin being used in all those spooky sci-fi movies, B movies, and that. You know, and it was the perfect sound. It sounded, it was new. It was a sound that you wouldn't hear in nature. So it didn't have a lot of the harmonics you get in natural sounds. Natural sounds have got all sorts of random harmonics throughout them, and the synthesizer was it sounded alien because it was new, and it was organised. It was too fixed in its waveform to be a natural sound mostly. So it did sound new, and it also looked new. It, you know, lots of knobs, no strings, sometimes not even a keyboard, and it makes all these swooping, you know, whooshy noises that have become increasingly associated with science fiction. Which came first is another question. I mean, they arrived more or less at the same time in the popular image, science fiction movies and synthesizers, and they were the appropriate instrument because they were new and futuristic as well. I mean, now we are at an interesting point where it's not so new.
It is. It is not new. Yeah.
You know,
I have to agree with you.
Yeah.
In fact, I was about to ask you about that. You know, it's sort of gone back to the raw kind of music that used to exist in the late 50s and early 1960s. But
yeah, again, I'm a great believer in the cycles of things. You know, you see it happen all the time. You know,
but do you think we are going to see a period like that again?
Undoubtedly.
The movement that we saw in the late 1970s and the early 80s.
Yeah, it is odd, and I do wonder, you know, why don't they?
Something like punk.
You know, they came after the punk movement, and actually we did have a big. I mean, if you think right up to the rave scene, right?
Even the 90s with the
and techno with Prodigy, you know, who are another pioneer. I mean, they were really taking electronic synthesis and making some really striking music that I thought was very modern, very futuristic, quite aggressive too, and interestingly, it was almost sort of punk synthesis, wasn't it, in a way? But you know, using all that stuff and using it in a musical way and applying it in a genre that's comfortable to them, I think there's always possibilities for it. And you know, synthesis has got so. I mean, it's so much of what we do now. I mean, you know, everyone's got a home keyboard with 10,000 sounds on it, and some of those sounds are incredibly nice and rich, and some of them are naturalistic and are sampled synthesized sounds like strings and, you know, trumpets and so forth. So you actually have that facility of those, and that is synthesis in a sense. But we're really talking about real synthesis in that other way. But you know, I don't know if you've looked into things like granular synthesis. You know, in the way, you know, this new and radically random and unpredictable waveforms that are generated from sampling anything. You know, it's just extraordinary what you can sample and take a slice and start messing with it and looping it and scattering it about. You know, it's quite mad, and And so some people will come along every now and then who are absolutely besotted with this equipment, and they'll make great new sounds, and they will build a piece of music on it, undoubtedly. It used to happen a lot in the 80s as a producer too, that like there's somebody who came out with a new keyboard, and within so the first month or two, a lot of producers would be rushing to get the latest keyboard because they knew there would be sounds on it that hadn't been used before. And so if you're the first to use a sound, suddenly it's your sound, it becomes your trademark sound.
Yes.
I mean, I think of the Orinoco Flow, by Enya. Yeah, that's a D50 sort of plucked string,
and even with the Cure, 17 seconds, the sound that Mike Hedges, the engineer, he managed to get a particular sound for that album, which has become their trademark now. Atmospheric and
which album?
Moody sound. 17 seconds by the Cure.
Oh yes. Oh yeah.
And Mike Hedges was behind that.
He's a good engineer and producer too. Good man. But that's right. You get a sound, and it's it defines the records. But every new keyboard thing would come out with, and it'd be new. Nowadays, they all come out with all the same sounds, except for things like granular are interesting because you do get fantastically rich and original waveforms that you've never heard before.
Yeah. So thank you very much for taking your time for this interview.
My pleasure.